I'm Sarah Seberg. Welcome to Kingdom Real. Today we have a very special guest. Her name is Tricia Harmon, and she is here to tell us her incredible story, and we just can't wait to hear it. So thank you for coming.
It is my pleasure. I feel like I'm already family because I know your dad and your mom, and so I can't
Wonderful.
wait. Yeah,
Yay.
this is going to be great.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this. Yeah, this is great. So we'll just go ahead and get started. So tell me, what did you learn from your family of origin?
It's interesting that I would start there because a lot of memories were suppressed in those years just because of the dynamics of family. But through the years, they've been redeemed and turned into blessings, and a lot of reconciled areas and restored. So it is kind of fun to go back and talk about it, not because I'm back there as a victim, but God has used it in my life to bring me to where I am today. So I was one of 3 kids. Mom and dad are still alive. They've been married for 60, I think 3 years or 4 years.
That's great.
They're and so it is a blessing because I never realized how secure that was, and mainly because I was so insecure as a middle child. And so I do have some pretty traumatic moments of my childhood. Some of them I'm not ready to talk about because there are just too many things that shouldn't be spoken of just yet. But at the same time, I was born in an era of, the Kennedy era. And we went to church. We were Catholic, and I went to parochial school. I think I may have gotten kicked out of parochial school. and I was just that cute little pixie cut Pat, Patricia girl, and I loved sitting in church with my family. We just were all, in our little Kennedy outfits and looking the part. And I knew about God. I loved God, but I didn't know God really in an intimate way. And through the course of being raised, they say that the middle children are why rules are made. And I may have represented that segment of middle children because my parents did some pretty crazy things to try to reel me in or, gain control of things that I had no idea. So some of the discipline was pretty harsh. Some of my reactions were pretty harsh. So I was rebellious, defiant, stubborn, very reactive, which even caused more stringent rules and punishments.
Sure.
And through the years, it scarred me. I had no idea how much it did, but I didn't realize that this is not how most kids go through life. And so I love my parents dearly, and we have had these talks, and they have, through tears, been, saying they're so sorry. But I actually said, it's not about you. It's about me. And there was a point in my life when I was older that I actually went back and had to take care of all of that because it was starting to just stick with me. And I was identifying myself as that rebellious, defiant rebel rouser. I understand that. And so that phone call that I had with my parents as an adult was a game changer in our relationship. And I went through a very intentional period of praying and seeking God as to how I do it. And I made that call, and I asked them to forgive me. And I acknowledged what I had done, not justifying what they did, not excusing it, not kind of, making that something that wasn't important. But for me, it was all about how did I respond wrongly to it? How did I dishonor them? How did I rebel against them? And so for me to go back, and the reason why is because this was a pivotal turning point. I grew up in the church every day, like my grandma would take us to Latin Mass even. So church was a huge part. And yet I didn't have a relationship with Christ. And so that, I'm not saying that was not used of God. That childhood and everything that I experienced as a child was definitely something God used to bring me to himself as an adult.
That's amazing. Yeah. It's incredible what God can do, even in the worst of situations to, use that for his good, even later on.
And that's going to be the common thread throughout this entire talk.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. So you told me a couple like really great memories that you had. Just tell me one more like really fun favorite memory that you had when you were growing up.
Because middle children again just love being in the spotlight, most of us. I loved music. I loved theater. I loved doing plays. So I was in high school plays. In fact, in middle school, I was actually on the lunchroom. Our lunchroom was the gym. So that takes us back. They didn't have separate, areas. They just transformed that gym into a lunchroom, but it also had a stage. And so as soon as we got done with our lunch, we would hop up on stage, put our little 45 record on that record player, and sing, "I got a brand new pair of roller skates. You got a brand new key." And so I would sing. We would pantomime. We weren't, it was like this fun thing. And I was in plays, and then I was given the part of Maria in The Sound of Music in high school. Had no idea I would even get to that caliber, and I was thrilled. And it, for me, changed my trajectory. I was like, okay, I'm going to go to college, and I'm going to major in music and theater. And so that was a highlight because it was a direction, it was excitement, it was like, I can't wait. This is what I'm going to do with my life.
So. And you had found that stage, that audience that you were looking for.
I found my stage, yeah. So, great. And I actually would go to like Blue Lake Fine Arts Camp, or Northern Michigan had a summer program. And so I loved Ella. I loved Barbra Streisand because she cut her teeth on jazz. So I was identifying with a lot of jazz singers, learning how to scat, so yeah, those were some huge highlights, and thinking that was my course. I'm going to just play on stage my whole life.
Yeah. Are your siblings in theater or anything like that? Do they do?
No, my sister is not that person at all.
Okay.
She's
Older or younger?
Younger.
Okay.
And she's very pragmatic, and she's grounded and anchored, and has a way of making sure that I am when she doesn't feel I am. Yeah. And I can say thank you. What else? She just has that wonderful personality. And we had kind of hot and cold, relationships throughout our childhood as well, but we are really dear, good best friends right now. My brother was the jock and not musical at all. So yeah.
Yeah, firstborn.
Yes. Yes. And very much a people pleaser. And even though I was a people pleaser, I wasn't very good at it.
It's what the middle child's for, just kind of entertaining themselves and doing their things.
Yeah.
No, I do. I agree with that. So we're going to transition a little bit, and I would love to hear about what was one of your darkest, most painful moments. We kind of talked about the highs. We're going to go the other direction and kind of talk about the lows.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting that at that pinnacle of a high, it was the day that I traded in my religion for a relationship, and I'm married. And, we grew up in northern Michigan, and now all of a sudden we moved to the city. And so I'm not a city girl. Higgins Lake was my home. Higgins Lake was where I loved to hang out. And so now I am a wife, and I just find out I'm pregnant with our firstborn, and now we're moving to Grand Rapids. And I was also open to changing churches, because at this point it was sometimes you just can't even explain the pivots that God gives you, and the heart to be open to doing something different. And I was. And so my husband at the time would pray and ask the Lord, where do you want us to go to church? And lo and behold, it's Calvary Baptist Church on 28th Street.
Yep.
So the big pillars, and you could see it from the road back then. And he walks in August 1st and introduces himself and tells them that we're looking for a church. But he also tells them my story. And they told us afterwards, there's no way they're going to get her in here. I don't know what he told them, but they were not thinking that I was going to keep the appointment. And I come in and we sit down, and Pastor Bixby at the time leaned over and said, Tricia, have you come to a place in your spiritual life where if you were to die tonight, you'd know for sure you're going to heaven? Sarah, I was on the edge of my seat. Like, you can know? You can know you're going to heaven? Like, I never knew that. I was like, I know I'm, on the edge here. And then he said, well, if I were to ask you, if you were to go to heaven and stand before the Lord and he say, why should I let you into heaven? What would your answer be? And then I'm, putting my head down and I'm like fumbling. I'm like, well, I went to church all my life. I know I wasn't the best. And I'm just fumbling, trying to find an answer. And I'm like, I'm just going to cry out for his mercy. And then he started sharing me verse after verse after verse of what it meant to go from me relying on myself and my works to receiving Jesus Christ, believing on him and confessing him with my mouth and asking him to be Lord of my life. And by the time he got like halfway through that, I was like, I want this so bad.
That's amazing.
And then he asked me, is there any reason why you wouldn't want to receive Jesus Christ? And I said, no, I'm done with I want the relationship. And I just prayed right there. And I said, God, I don't know what's happened, prior to this moment, but right now, from here on out, I receive you as my Lord, and I give my life to you, and I dedicate myself to you. And after we got done praying, the pastor gave me a verse. Now, mind you, I'd prayed the rosary. We read our missalette every Sunday. I don't know that I may have tried to read the Bible, but never understood or, I didn't even know John 3:16.
Wow.
Yeah. And then he reads this passage, therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. And that was a King James version, obviously. But I'm bawling because I had it locked and loaded. And I'm like, I'm brand new. So that was like that high. And then immediately after that, because of my personality and temperament, I'm going back and I'm that zealous Christian, going back to my mom and dad and my sister, who I thought was really used of the Lord to even bring me to that point, sharing with them what I did and talking to them about, I can't keep it in. You need to know what happened to me. And it was not being received well. And it became so repetitive, and every time that we would get together, that my parents said, if you have to bring up Jesus in every conversation, we're going to disassociate from you.
Wow.
That was not what this girl was prepared for.
Right.
As a newly married wife, new mama, new Christian, in a new town with no support, and now all of a sudden the parents that I longed to please and get their approval of, and thinking that they would just be elated that I finally get this. And so we went for months and months and months, and they didn't talk. And I'm, expecting their first granddaughter. And so that was a very difficult time. Along with that were moral failures in the marriage already starting. So I would say my deepest moments were the estranged relationships, the moral failures. I had 4 miscarriages in the midst of that. And, as a pretty new Christian, the first time that miscarry happened. And then, just kind of these bullet points of going into ministry, from seeing jaw-dropping stories of my husband pastoring in the inner city of Grand Rapids to being called up to a Bible church up in Suttons Bay, and finding out the very day that we candidated that 2 of our daughters were sexually molested by their grandfather, my first husband's father, in our home while we were homeschooling, while we were not living, in accordance to anything of the world. We weren't even watching movies or listening to contemporary Christian music, let alone any other kind of worldly music. We weren't the don't choose and the don't do's. We were that family. And this happened. And it was absolutely devastating, and it took us a long time. But then it got worse. And then there was the loss of the pastorate, and devastating to me, and then the loss of the marriage, and then divorce and the abandonment and all of those things. So those are some pretty deep waters, and they didn't happen all at once, but I can tell you that there are times in my life where I felt like the tsunami-sized wave just kept crashing down and pulling me under, and then I'd just get my head up above water to take that deep breath, and then another one, and so after a while, it just became really difficult to separate, and I felt like a victim. I felt like I was very valueless and just stuck. Yeah.
So you're a pastor's wife.
And I was a pastor's wife.
And you have how many children?
God gave me 11 pregnancies and what I affectionately call 7 character builders.
Yeah, so what was that like, navigating life situations, right? You're just dealing with a lot of life situations. But in your role as a pastor's wife, what was that like, navigating all of these things while
raising
smiling
kids
and being a pastor's wife and, being a mom? Let's just expand a little bit on that.
Being a pastor's wife was such a fulfillment of a call that I really believe God laid on us as a family. I was Maria in The Sound of Music. I was an altar girl in the Catholic Church. I thought I was going to be a nun. Like, that's how close I wanted to be to God. And now I'm a pastor's wife, and it was like, okay, I'm not on this stage performing. I am now on God's platform. I am, and I saw it as a platform, as a sphere of influence. I get to speak into and teach and come alongside and love and encourage, equip, strengthen women and the community. And so, but I got to bring all of that fun stuff into it. So of course we, totally gutted the church out and turned it into the Pirates of the Caribbean and just made it this fun fantasy place to do VBS. Or my kids would do the puppet ministry and write the scripts, or my kids would be on stage with me and we were doing community theater and whatnot. So it was really amazing to know that we have a community that loved us and embraced us, and I got to be who I wanted to be, but I wasn't letting them see who I was on the inside. So nobody knew about the moral failures. No one knew about my childhood. No one knew about, maybe a few people knew at that point about the assault on the 2 girls. And that resulted in a prison sentence. But we were told to not talk about it. We were told that, do not take this up to this new church. You are not to talk about it. And it was isolating. It was insulating. We were alone. And as a pastor's wife, trying to be, do, and give, and pour myself out to everybody else and not be poured into. And I'm going through multiple confessions of moral failures and trying to heal and be whole and learn how to forgive. And so, it was a very, I'm trying to think of the word. It was just a bittersweet. I was doing exactly what I knew God called me to do, but I was trying to keep everything going. I was the fixer. I was the hole filler. I was the family gal who kind of maintained everything on the home front, and then kept trying to prop my husband up as the man I knew he could be and should be, and yet the real one kept showing up. Yeah.
So who did you go to for support? I mean, really, God, I'm assuming
It
you had
was.
a lot of
It was-
conversations with God, but did you have anybody in your life that you could talk to about what was going on?
I thought I did, and I tried very hard, but it's kind of like I had a lot of carpet fiber interactions with the Lord, like sucking up carpet fibers like nobody's business,
Yeah.
just crying out to the Lord and asking Him. But the relationships were not to the caliber because I wasn't opening up. They didn't realize how wounded and hemorrhaged I was. So when I would try to engage, it was just too difficult for people. They didn't know what to do with it.
Right.
And I've said, and going in, like we did so many conferences, homeschool conferences, ministry, pastoral conferences, leadership conferences. So I was conferenced out. I knew, and I would try to connect and have these networks, and they'd only go about that far. Mm-hmm. And I just never knew why until God revealed and said, Tricia, you're being a hypocrite. You're not being transparent. You're not being authentic.
Right.
And you know what? If you have to throw up in the middle of the room and just let it sit there for a hot minute, you need to do that. But you do that in front of good people. you know, like,
Yeah.
and I didn't know how to do that. There were times where we were in the middle of a room and, the established relationships were very shallow. And here I'm starting to open up. And then they didn't know what to do with it. So then I just try to sweep it up and go, and I shrink back into, I call it my vulnerable, valueless victim mentality. And there's a difference between being vulnerable in living a transparent life and being vulnerable to be victimized all over again. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Because we are called to be vulnerable, but not to the point where we set ourselves up and there are no boundaries, and then we receive accusations, condemnations, criticisms that really they shouldn't be sticking, and yet they do.
So I find, I was a pastor's daughter growing up, and so I watched, you were talking about like kind of the shallowness of the relationships, and, I find that happens quite a bit, not only to pastors themselves, but to pastors' wives, pastors' kids. There's never like that super deep connection, and I remember people used to keep my dad kind of at like arm's length, like, oh, well, we're friends, but he's also my pastor.
Right.
Or with my mom, it was like, we're friends, but you're also the pastor's wife,
Yeah.
So I just wondered, what that was like for you. And then you just shared about that as well. So
Yeah, just to add another caveat to that is that even though I had, like you said, when you have 7 kids, and for me, living in a world of legalism, dogma, religiosity, the do's and don'ts, we actually found ourselves trying to integrate, but you knew that you were a glass house. And you have 7 kids who are wearing denim skirts and khaki jumpers and stair steppers and I can only imagine what neighbors must have thought of us as we're walking down the street, and my daughter's playing the piccolo for the homeschool marching band, and all these little kids are behind her doing all the choreography to that next marching band program that they're going to do. So I know we were weird, and I know people thought we were cultic. We were in a homeschool curriculum that really fostered that kind of mentality. But I thought it was the right thing to do. And so I just kept owning it. I just kept fulfilling my obligation and trying. I'd get my kids up at 4:30 in the morning and have devotions because their dad was going to go to work. But we got to have devotions. Who does that? Right?
very devoted parents.
Yeah, or out of balance. Because I was it's interesting because I think I was saved out of religion and then added religion back to my relationship.
Oh, that's interesting.
Trying to be that perfect Christian.
So you went from being the middle child, having to have that, it has to be, perfect, making everybody happy, to being the mom and the wife and the pastor's wife in there, same thing, wanting to have everybody be happy and have everything be good. And it's interesting to me how patterns from childhood tend to follow us,
Yeah.
whether we want them to or not.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean my motive was wrong.
Right. Absolutely.
It's just my mindset was.
Absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit, because we've got just a couple minutes left. You've shared a lot about how God, met you in those moments. And if you could just give us a little bit more of that. You went through all these different things, and just tell me how God met you and how he helped you through those things.
One of the things that made the biggest difference in my life was ministering to those that were in the inner city. Alcoholics, drug addicts, drug lords, witches, prostitutes, you name it, every walk of life. They were in our home. We were, we would have them in our home for dinner, or I'd cut their hair, or give them a facial, a manicure, a pedicure, whatever it was. And we'd get done and we'd sit in the living room and our blinds are still up, and they're like, aren't you going to pull those down?
Yeah.
And we're like, why? Well, because people are going to go and case your place, and most of the people cased in your place are people you know. And I said, well, in our home, we've already dedicated it all to the Lord. And for me, that was being authentic and real. But at the same time, having these transformational stories of people's lives just radically being transformed, and doing Bible studies and speaking to women out of my own hurt, but not really sharing the depth of the hurt that there was.
Right.
So for me, the real blessing in being a pastor's wife was growing as a pastor's wife, growing as a Christian, and reproducing reproducers. Even when we're broken, even in the depths of our own pain, God still can use us to minister to others. And I've had some criticism of, well, you need to just go heal yourself first. And I'm like, but it's in the midst of that pain and coming along somebody else who's in pain too, that the healing happens.
I agree with that.
And so for me, losing ministry was like I wore black to the resignation service when he was uninstalled. It was a death of a vision for me, and I for years have prayed, Lord, you've taken me out of that ministry, but you haven't taken that ministry out of this heart. Wow. So I've had a pastor's wife's heart for ever since, and that's where I've asked God to just use it however he's wanted. And maybe if we have time again to talk about what God does with the death of visions and this whole pregnancy thing, because I have a huge story on, yes, I've had 11 pregnancies, but God has given me this repetitive dream of being pregnant and never birthing the baby.
Wow.
I know.
Wow. On that note, would you be willing to tell more of that story?
Kind of a cliffhanger, isn't it?
I'm totally feeling like we're going to need a second part of this here. So just in our last couple minutes, I just want to thank you for being here. And, there is so much more of your story.
Yeah.
And I really feel like we do need to continue it on, and just share more of it.
Because there's hope.
There is hope.
There's hope for people women especially, who can learn how to be authentic and unashamed rather than people-pleasing and valueless. There's hope for people to be transparent and becoming vulnerable rather than just staying silent and victimized. Right. And there's hope for people to be bold with boundaries without being victimized in secret.
Amen. That's incredible. So I'm just going to end it right here, and we're just going to start up with the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Kingdom Real, and we will be back for part 2 with Tricia in a little while.